Well, God bless you and good evening, everybody. To all of you who are joining us live and those who are going to watch later, God bless you and welcome to Lent Talks Week 2. I am Pastor Darrell Williams, the senior pastor of the St. Paul Church in Oxon Hill, and we are happy to have you with us for our Lent Talks. Lent Talks are very simple. We bring in thought leaders, congregational leaders, and just good old-fashioned good folk to give us some good insights about how to live better lives as Christians and about how to do better things in the world. So I'm glad you're joining us this evening. Listen, I want to tell you something. The book of James tells us in James chapter 2, and many of us have heard this over and over again. We've heard, show me your faith and I'll show you my works. Show me your works and I'll show you my faith. And faith without works is dead. What I want you to know is that I seem to have frozen. Oh, okay, there we are. We're back. I froze for a second there. What I want you to know is that faith without works is dead is a commonly heard theme, but the question is, how do we show our faith and our works? I want you to know how we're going to do that. This week, our guest is the Reverend Tony Lee, the senior pastor of the Community of Hope AME Church in Temple Hills, Maryland. Pastor Lee is not only a friend of mine, but he's a friend, a brother beloved, and he is one of the most active pastors I've ever met. And when I say active, I mean he leads his church, but he also leads in the community. He's also the host of Sunday Morning Hope on WPGC. I don't know how this brother fits all that stuff in a day, but he fits it all in. Here's the thing. One of the things I love about Tony Lee is that, there are many people who will say that the church is dead, the church's activism is dead. Pastor Lee is a practicing pastor and a practicing community activist. So I thought it would be great for him to come in and talk to us about what it means to be the Christian as activists. So I'm asking you right now, he can't hear you, but we are live. So throw some praise hands, throw some clap hands in the comments as we welcome our speaker for this evening, my guest, the Reverend Tony Lee, senior pastor of the Community of Hope AME Church in Temple Hills, Maryland. Let's welcome him to the St. Paul Lent Talks.
Dr. Williams, how you, man?
How are you, my friend?
Man, I'm great, man. It's good to be here with you. St. Paul, one more again.
Man, it is good to have you with us. Everybody, welcome Pastor Lee. It's good to have him with us. As you all know, this is live. So if you've got stuff to say, questions you want to ask, put them in the chat. I will ask them as they go along because we want to make this interactive for everybody. Pastor Lee, thank you so much for joining us. We said that already. Man, it's hard to interview your friends because you want to be looking at my boy. So it's just hard to interview your friends sometimes. But man, it's good to see you. Tonight we're talking about being a Christian as activists. What does it mean to really live out, live out knowing that faith without works is dead, showing your faith by showing your works. I brought you in because you've made a life off of doing this. You are not a person who is new to this. You're true to this. You've been doing this for a long time. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started as being a Christian activist.
Man, so I am Tony Lee, Reverend Tony Lee, the pastor of Community of Hope AME Church. And really what started me was I was blessed towards the end of college to run into a ministry called Ebenezer AME Church and Dr. Granger, Dr. Joanne Browning. And what was interesting was that, one, I joined the church because they had congos, because I'm go forever. It was the first church in my life that I had ever been to, and they had two Congo players playing at the same time. It was just amazing to me. A classical Congo player and a go-go Congo player, but that's not for this session. The second thing, though, it was a charismatic environment, and so I had never seen people have hands laid on them and never experienced things like the gifts of the Spirit or anything like that and faith healing. But third, he preached about us being transformed to become agents of transformation. And that was a little mind-blowing to me. I, was in school reading all this Pan-African thought, kind of thought I was kind of deep. And this brother was talking about how our community should be better because we were there. And because we were saved by the power of the Holy Ghost, that the community should not stay the same. And so the community shouldn't have issues or shouldn't be dealing with the issues it does because we have the power to help transform community. And that was in Prince George's County in the late 80s, early 90s. But I watched, and that was Prince George's County was very different then. I watched that church take an active role in helping transform Prince George's County. I watched that church taking that. I watched that pastor. It would be Bible study Wednesday, and he said instead of Bible study, we all go into the school board because there's a school called Roger B. Taney, and Roger B. Taney was one of the justices in the Dred Scott and some major decision. And he said that we're going to get that school renamed, and that school now is Thurgood Marshall Middle School. So
Wow.
that was kind of the ministry. So I come in, they laying hands, the sick getting healed, the bound to getting delivered, but also schools' names are changing.
Sure, sure.
You know, I'm watching them shift the color of the political establishment in Prince George's County. That they would have men's night. I remember when the riots were happening in LA, and it was men's night, and the guest speaker would be Reverend Jesse Jackson, straight from LA. And
Sure.
Reverend Jackson would be in there totally exhausted because he's just coming from LA, but he's sitting and telling us what's happening on the ground in LA with the riots, telling us the political moves of it and that kind of a piece. And so it was that kind of a ministry. They would bring in Egyptologists like Ivan Van Sertima to come and talk about like Africa in a way that I'd never heard about Africa before and its connections to African Americans, and how policy influenced all of the things that influenced our lives. And so that was kind of how I caught the bug. And Pastor Browning and Pastor Joanne Browning, they literally just mentored me along the process. And for me, that was kind of the framework I had for starting the work.
So one of the things that's fascinating about your story to me is if you know the history of Christianity in America, once you hit the civil rights movement, you have these splits in the Black church about what to do about civil rights. You had people who were, Martin Luther King, the pro-King protesting group. And then you had people who were saying, hey, we need to be incrementalists. We need to slow down, step back. And then you had some people who said, that's not what we should be doing at all. We should simply be, we should be sojourners on this land and wait for glory to come. You found yourself in a church that was Pentecostal in flavor and fervor and social activistic in nature at the same time. So they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Right, exactly. And I think that church even being that way in that time was a radical kind of a move, because you got to remember Ebenezer was an AME church, and at that point it was a part of the neo-Pentecostal movement in the AME church, which was fought against. So even in the AME church, it was radical. So the AME church was a place that historically had a social justice move, but it did not have the neo-Pentecostal move. And so I find myself in a historically social justice denomination, but in this neo-Pentecostal kind of space, with a pastor who, I think the craziest way I could explain it is that in 1 week they had both T.D. Jakes and Louis Farrakhan, Honorable Louis Farrakhan, at the church in the same week. How that happened, I don't know another place on the earth that can happen, right? I mean, it was like Bishop T.D. Jakes, I think Bishop Jakes was like on a Tuesday, and Honorable Louis Farrakhan was on a Friday. It was that kind of a coming together of the spiritual and the social justice, etc. And for Pastor Brown, he didn't see any difference. He didn't see that there was kind of one or the other, but he saw how it all fit, because he said everything we do is to the glory of God, and it's all by the power of the Holy Ghost. And so in that, and you got to remember, our social justice movements were impacted spiritually. That before we ever went to march, we went to the church to have worship.
Sure.
Because it was the power from the worship that galvanized us to go do the marching.
Sure.
It was the power of the worship that helped us with the strategy. And so I think that was what I learned there. It was incredible being there during that season.
Sure. So you said that happened as you were finishing college, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So how did that shape? Now, were you called to ministry at that point, or did your call come after that?
My call came while I was there in that kind of an environment.
Okay. So looking back, you've been in ministry 20 plus years at this point. How do you think that environment shaped the minister you became? How did it give you a view of what you were trying to do as you move forward in ministry?
It made a certain perspective on ministry normative. So it made it normal for me to feel that we could do worship in a nightclub. Like that was normal because I was always hearing Tom Skinner talk about ministering to prostitutes on 14th Street, right? That was a regular person, but it also made it normal for me to feel like we had to have just be engaged community because he would also have Pastor Willie Wilson there in the same meeting that Tom Skinner was there. And Willie Wilson is, one of the most amazing kind of social justice
Sure.
icons that there is. So I'm hearing all of that, and I don't even know a call to ministry yet. I'm just a young brother at the meeting, and this is what I'm seeing as what is normal. This is what preachers do, because even though I came out of a church family, I didn't come out of a preacher family. So
Sure.
I'm the first. I was the first, and in my crew, I was the first to accept my call, and so it just made kind of this watching how they moved, watching how they organized the church, watching how they brought the church in the movement space, and those kinds of pieces. It made it normal, and then when I left out and then came back, the tables they kept putting me at, I'd be sitting somewhere and I get a call from them. Hey, we need to go to a meeting for us. Okay. And where's the meeting? Oh, it's the NCNW. You'll be meet with Dr. Dorothy Height. And I'd be sitting in the basement at the National Coalition of Negro Women and Dr. Height, and it'd be like 10 of us at a table and
Sure.
a speakerphone on a conference call, and we'd be talking to organizations all over the nation. And Dr. Height would be, and I'd be like, how is this old lady still awake? I'm about to pass out. Right? And I didn't even really fully get who Dorothy Height was in that moment. I'm just
Sure.
by this point, I'm on staff with them now. I've come back and I'm on ministerial staff, but they're just sitting me at tables. The first time I met Reverend Jesse Jackson, like personally, it's a New Year's Eve, and Pastor Brown is like, "Hey Tony, what you doing?" I'm like, "I'm getting ready for New Year's Eve youth service." It's like, "Well, before that, I want you to come over. We're gonna go over Jesse Jackson's house." What are you talking about? All right.
What do you mean we're
And I'm
going to go over to
sitting,
Jesse Jackson's house?
what do you talk about? Yeah, it's gonna be a few of us. We're gonna talk about, kind of what he needs to be talking about for this next year for Black America. And I get over there, and it's like 6 of us in the living room. Mrs. Jackson comes in, waves at us. How y'all doing? Ron Walters, a great political strategist, the great political theory. And I'm sitting there with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and I'm starting to say stuff. And then, like 3 days later, I'm watching the news, and he's saying the stuff I talked to him about for the state of Black America. We need to go. And Reverend Jesse Jackson is running my run on CNN. And I'm sitting here like, what just happened? And I'm saying that because, you're kind of watching kind of the power of mentorship. You're kind of watching the power of people who are already doing it, seeing something in somebody and saying, okay, I'm just going to keep putting you, I don't need to go to all the meetings. I'm going to send you there. But the meetings are with like some of the top names, I'm walking the meetings. Oh, that's Marian Wright Edelman. Hi, I'm representing Dr. Granger Browning. I said, this is a little kid. And it's these major people in the room.
Now, you just hit on something I want to talk about real quick, because you started off as a youth minister.
Mm-hmm.
But you were given a lot of opportunities while being a youth minister. So my question for you is, as one of the people who had a mantle passed to them, what do you feel the church should be doing right now to be equipping our young people? I often hear young people say that they're not sure they have a place in the church. But you, at a young age, were at some very interesting tables and doing some very interesting things. What do you say? What do you say to the person that says, how do we get youth involved in this? Because as I think about it, if you look at the civil rights movement, you've got the King generation, then you've got kind of Jesse and John Lewis, and then it becomes a little bit harder to trace that next pass of the baton. So as somebody who's lived it, tell us a little bit about how that works.
So I think there's a couple of things. One, I think you have to be actively thinking about pipeline development, and looking about how do we develop young leaders. You also have to look at the fact that, so as you were talking about kind of the King generation, the Jesse, John Lewis generation, that kind of thing, and kind of the Sharpton generation, right? As you're looking at that, you got to remember they were in their 20s and 30s,
Sure.
right? They were, I mean, like when they first started hitting, they were in their 20s and their 30s. I love the boomers, but the boomers taught us a fable. And the fable was that you are supposed to wait until I hand it to you. When the reality is baby boomers were never handed anything. They snatched everything they got. Every platform they stood on from a civil rights standpoint, they kind of snatched it. They don't know how to hand something off. And so what's happened is they're not wired to hand it off. That's not in their DNA because it wasn't really handed to them. They stepped into the moment, snatched it, and ran. But we've been carrying their bags and doing all this kind of stuff because we expected them to hand it to us, and they don't have handoff in them. Not everyone, but I'm talking about if you just look at the movement. So here you have now then folks who are saying, how do we get young people into kind of movement? We have to be actively focused on giving them opportunities, realizing that what we're calling young isn't young anymore. Sure. So we're treating 37-year-old people as if they're the children's church, when at their job they manage 100 people and oversee a multi-million, tens of millions of dollar budget, but we're treating them as if they can't take up the usher's offering out of a piece, right? And as if they may not have learned anything from what they do to be an asset to the church, and that it has to be done the way kind of it's been done. And so there's a need for us really to focus. The other thing is we got to look at the fact that the church is graying, the church is getting much older. Sure. And we're skipping generations. And so we've got to really look at how do we put people, and it's not just how do we give you a little something to do. I was blessed that the Brownings were at 20 something and early 30s were handing me the keys to the house. And we're like, we believe in you, here, run it. And out of that, then I was able to grow. And they were handing me relationships to then be able to grow my own relationships and my own Rolodex, so that people they introduced me to, I can now call myself, and they're on my own cell phone.
Sure. Okay. So tell me this. We're talking about the Christian as activist.
Mm-hmm.
I have two questions for you. One, how do you define activist? I mean, we throw that word around a lot, but what is it to be a Christian activist?
And so I would say that I don't necessarily have a great definition of activist for you. I do have a definition of Christian.
Okay.
Right. And so as a Christian, so I don't see a Christian as activist. I see a Christian as Christian. Okay. And activism is a part of what a Christian does.
All right, let's build that up.
Right. A Christian is God's hands and feet in this world. A Christian is fighting against spiritual wickedness and principalities in high places. A Christian is someone who is trying to advance the kingdom of God. And what often happens is, so here's what happens. We can often get so caught up in morality that we are taught to folks about morality, but don't deal with the systems that are set to keep them in the same kind of a situation. And so we talk about, hey, just stay saved. Hey, just stay joyful. Hey, just tithe. Hey, do that. But we're not dealing with the systems that are shaped to be able to keep them financially bound, to be able to keep them spiritually bound, to be able to keep them depressed, to be able to keep them in jail, to be able to keep them as the second and the third and the fourth instead of the first. And so we talk about you're the head and not the tail, the lender and not the borrower, but we're not dealing with the systems that are doing predatory lending to be able to keep people as the borrower and never the lender. You see what I'm saying? And so there has to be a connector to say, hold on, that there's some battles that I'm helping people understand a role that God has for their life in living. But in some ways, I'm setting people up if I'm not also looking at how do we deal with the systems that continue to perpetrate evil in their lives. And so therefore, I'm just fighting the evil. I'm fighting the darkness. I'm just fighting the spiritual wickedness in high places. And so for me, then you don't have to do this mental gymnastics about how can I be an activist. My question is, how can a Christian not be an activist? Now, how that activism plays out is very different in different situations, mattering on your gift and how God has you lined up. But I think everybody has to be fighting against demons. Everybody needs to be fighting against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Sure, sure. Just right out of Romans, war is not against flesh and blood.
That's
So
right.
let's go back into a little past the league history. What was your first protest? What was the first thing you went to where you were like, I'm going to go out and try to make a difference here?
Wow. I don't remember.
Wow.
Wow. I don't remember. But I think it's because it all kind of blends together.
Sure.
So I think because the work with young people and helping young people try to become who they're called to be, the work in communities that were kind of being underserved, um, I'm sitting there trying to remember. I think one of the first protests I remember speaking at was an Al Sharpton protest here in DC when Reverend Sharpton saw me and asked me to come up and speak because he had known me from New York and I had spoken at some of his conferences before. But all that was still connected to all the stuff. Um, Probably the first protest was something Ebenezer was doing in Prince George's County. I would think something around the schools or something like that. That would probably be the first protest. One of my first ministerial protests was as youth minister when Pastor Jamal Bryant was at Empowerment, a young empowerment temple, when it was at the college. And I was doing his youth revival. And on the third night of youth revival, he decided he wanted that to be on the steps of the school board. And I had to preach, and I brought like a bus load up and choir and everything, and the choir sang, and I preached because they were protesting something was happening in the schools in Baltimore. And somebody got saved like at the protest. It was amazing. It was great.
Very
It
good.
was great fun. It was great fun
Very good.
with another
So
one of our brothers.
we've talked a lot about sort of the individual as as activists and how that really is just a part of being a believer. Let's talk a little institutional. Tell me about some of the stuff the Community of Hope is doing right now to engage the community and create and foster change.
So I'll go at institution in a couple of directions. One, I'll talk about our Hope Activism Institute.
Okay.
And what we have done is my Minister of Social Justice, Reverend Leslie DeWhite, who is just an incredibly amazing sister. She has been running a series of sessions with various thought leaders and various activists, really kind of talking and training folks around activism. That there's a couple of other pieces that will be connecting to it because our prayer is to develop, as you said, kind of this new cadre of leaders
Mhm.
to give people kind of the kind of skill sets and the tools they can to be able to move forward in leadership. And so I think the Hope Activism Institute is one thing. I believe that as a church, one of the challenges of churches during the last decade, I would say, is that last 20 years probably, is that it's the biggest time we usually step into activism is during election season.
Sure.
And the biggest way we step into activism during election season is actually just bringing numbers to people. But we've forgotten the art and the science of the electoral process. And so what happens is organizations usually depend on us and help organize us, and we just bring numbers and we give them numbers, but we're not thinking about uh, the phone banking or the text banking, or we're not looking at what the issues are in our own communities and how to impact those. If you think about it, in most areas, most local elections are won by the hundreds, not by the tens of thousands.
Sure.
So they're won by like hundreds or a couple of thousand votes, not tens of thousands. A well-organized church can shift most local elections, for most regular offices, for things that are happening in their community. The
So
people
the
who are going
stuff
to run.
that affects us day to day, school,
Exactly.
county commissioners, county,
Exactly.
maybe not county executive in a place the size of Prince George's County, but
Right.
certainly many of those lower tier things that we never hear about, never talk about, that, the winning vote is, 158 to 143 type of thing.
Exactly. Or even the winning vote wins by 1,100 votes,
Sure.
right? There are enough people in the area surrounding most of our churches, if we organize, that we literally can turn the tide in that kind of a piece,
Sure.
right? But what happens is that we just end up kind of being other folks' props. And so they just tell us, hey, we needed to come out. So our folks go out and they kind of vote. But we're not being strategic about, okay, what are the issues that are important to this community? What are the issues that are important to our folks? What are the issues that are important kind of where we're at? One of my big pieces, and you know this, is inside the Beltway, Prince George's County. That people seem to think that mid county's tea is tastes better, their ice is colder, their grass is greener, their milk got more moo to it, just everything, right? And the fact of the matter is, that what happens is that then mid county Prince George's County ends up having greater access to the political process. And their folks are more engaged and end up being more sophisticated when it comes to the politics. So politicians pay attention to them. And so their schools get more resources, their communities get more resources. Now, granted, that if you look at the amount of money a lot of those folks are making, but the fact of the matter is, then it happens at the detriment to inside the Beltway, Prince George's County, to southern Prince George's County. And our schools end up not getting it. And this is historical in Prince George's County. And so, but what ends up happening, though, is a rising tide raises all boats. But if you let an area fall down, the whole county eventually will fall down, because it'll creep into the rest of the county. And so you can think that, oh, I can let the carjackings just stay down there in Hillcrest Heights right now. But the carjackers will run out of cars in Hillcrest Heights, and they'll start commuting to your neighborhood, start jacking y'all because y'all got nicer cars. So there's a need to be able to have the kind of impact for social. The other thing, from an organizational standpoint, is the work I'm blessed to do with the Black Church PAC, the Black Church Political Action Committee. And with that does deal with how to organize the Black church people, to be able. And so the Black Church PAC has played in a lot of local elections, a lot of states attorneys elections, even some regional state elections, and some national pieces. And we've been able to literally impact and turn out hundreds of thousands of voters and touch hundreds of thousands of people, to make differences in some of these races. And we've got some of the data to show it. And so I've been blessed to be able to do that as well.
Great. Listen, we have some questions that are beginning to come in from the audience, so we want to get to some of those. I'm going to ask you one more question, just because I kind of want to clarify something. Well, not really clarify. You'll understand when I ask the question. But for those of you in the audience, I want you to start sending in your questions so we can start asking Reverend Lee some of these questions, because this isn't just my show. This is everybody's show. We want everybody to be able to ask questions and get answers while we got great thought leaders like Reverend Lee. Reverend Lee, this is what I want to ask you. Oftentimes, are we too limited in how we think about being a Christian as activists? One of the things that I have admired about your church is that you all have never had a we'll call it permanent building. I mean, you started off in the Legend nightclub, and that is a legendary story that everybody knows. You guys then moved to Iverson Mall, and then right before COVID, you all were moving into a roller rink because there were some things that Iverson
Right.
Mall, you were displaced from that space. But what was interesting to me, the reason I bring up activism beyond electoral politics and marching, is that even after you all didn't have a typical church home, you were feeding people by the thousands. And that to me is an act of activism, to be changing your community for the better outside of electoral politics, outside of voting, outside of marching in the streets. How are you able to do that from a virtual space?
So, and I think, and that's a great question. And I think that I'd have to shout out the Black Panther Party movement.
Okay.
If you look at the Black Panthers, I think one of the things that we missed that was the brilliance of the Black Panther Party was that they understood the need of taking care of people's immediate physical needs, right? So they had feeding programs and they had schools and they had things that were dealing with people's immediate, right in front of them needs, while also they understood the need to impact public policy. They knew it wasn't enough to just deal with the physical need and not deal with policy, but it wasn't enough to deal with policy and not deal with folks' physical needs. And so I think that in the communities we're in, that we haven't just focused on electoral politics, we focus on issues around HIV and AIDS, around violence, around food insecurity, around the schools and those kinds of pieces. And so activism can look very different in different seasons in different ways. And so activism can look like marching with the police in communities, trying to shift a community partnership with the police. And when we first moved, when we first started, one of the reasons we started where we started was because the crime was so high. 10 years later, the governor, the county exec, chief of police, etc., were all at the church, and they held a press conference at the church talking about how the crime had dropped by 50% in that community and across Prince George's County, and listed us as one of the partners in that process, right?
50%.
That's activism. 50%. Most folks don't realize that crime in Prince George's County a few years ago had dropped 50% across all levels.
Wow.
50%. It is the worst told story in the history, I think, of Prince George's County. We had this incredible decrease in crime, and we did it at the same time while arresting less people. So it wasn't because we locked up all of the criminals. It was because we focused services in the communities where crime was happening and tried to systemically deal with some of the poverty issues that were happening in those communities. And we watched crime drop. It was because of community police partnering. It was because of those kinds of pieces. But folks miss all of that, especially because of the national narrative around police. That's activism, though. That's activism, like fighting in the middle of COVID to try to find masks is activism. Tapping into the supply chain when our folks were having problems getting masks and just giving away masks. At one point, we gave masks to the county. At one point, we gave toilet paper to the county as a church because they were having issues in some of the senior locations. And we gave like 6,000 rolls of toilet paper to the county and 10,000 masks and, and all this food we were giving away, et cetera. And so I think that meeting people's practical everyday needs is just as important as being able to meet the social policy stuff. But I think that we can't take one or the other. I think that you have to see activism as both and that's at least how we frame it in our shape and our mindset.
Awesome. Well, you ready for some questions from the audience?
Yes, sir.
All right. I feel like Oprah running out with my mic right now. From the audience, what suggestions do you have for a social action ministry that is just getting started in the church?
My suggestion for a social action ministry just getting started is to start is that you can't do it all and you can't fight every fight. Find one or two issues that you can really drill down into and work on that. Like I said, when we first started Community of Hope, we were a young church in a nightclub, and my folks wanted to do all kinds of stuff and be engaged in all kinds of ways. And I said, as a church, this wasn't just a social justice ministry. I said, as outreach, as a church, we were just going to focus on violence, on HIV and AIDS, and on the schools. And that was the three things we're going, and we focused on that for probably 8-10 years before we really branched out to a lot of other things. Those three areas were the areas. And so my thing would be focus like a laser, find out, and don't do something just because it's what everyone else is doing right now. Do what your human capacity is good for. I had people who are really good around HIV and AIDS stuff. I had people who are really good around violence stuff, people who are really good around school stuff. I matched up our work with the gifts we had in the church at the moment. Over the years, our gifts shifted, and so we were able to expand to do domestic violence stuff. We were able to expand to do like a lot of other kinds of pieces. But in the beginning, it was, no, we're focusing on this. And if you focus on something real strong, you can become nationally known for just being a one-trick pony as long as you got the right trick.
Nationally known for being a one-trick pony. So find your issue and focus in on that.
That's right. That's right.
Try to do everything. Do the thing that you can do to make an impact.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Another question from the audience. What do you do to get people involved and to get them to want to do the work?
So I think it's a couple of things. One, I think you have to hear from the people what they feel their needs are. So I think a challenge sometimes with social action ministries is that we can be way up here in what we believe is justice instead of dealing with what are the heart issues for the people in our community. And so you find their pain points. And when you find folks' pain points, then you see how to do things that are connecting with that, but also find ways to have easy victories, find low-hanging fruit. Don't reach for the moon too quick. Find the stuff that's really right, but find easy wins, because what happens is folks are drawn to winners. And so if you can show a victory and then another victory, but they're easy wins, easy small victories. But when people start to see that kind of a piece, then people will start to want to come to it. One, because it's connecting to issues that are connecting to their pain points. But two, they're able to see, oh no, y'all are really doing something, because folks are really used to a lot of folks talking right now, especially in the social action area. Sure. They're used to folks talking a whole lot of talk and getting nothing done. If you can show that your social action ministry actually gets stuff done, it can be small stuff, but it will become big stuff as you just keep moving. But don't despise small beginnings, and focus on the small stuff and focus on the needs that people have right there. Listen to people. People will tell you what they want. And when they tell you, then start helping them move right there.
So I hear you saying two things. One, you actually have to know your community that you're trying to help. Like, you can't be inside and say, this is what we think you need. You actually have to be immersed with the people to be able to know what their actual pain points are and what actual relief they need. And two, it sounds like you're saying the stuff that you all do is not just community of hope people. It sounds to me like you're saying you all network and connect with folk outside to make a difference in the ministry that you do. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So let's say with our activism work around HIV and AIDS, which we've been blessed now to be nationally recognized for. And there have been national stories, regional stories, et cetera, and even a movie we're in called The Gospel of Healing, that our model is lifted up in, and it shows 5 models nationally around HIV and AIDS ministry, and we're one of those models. Well, the reality is that we started testing 9 months in. When our first Sunday at Iverson Mall, we started doing HIV and AIDS testing. And we've been testing quarterly for almost 14 years now. But yet my team has never performed one test. We've always had a partner organization that had the funding and the resources to actually do the testing and have wraparound services that we could recommend our people to if they tested positive. So we never became an HIV and AIDS organization, but our programmatic stuff has been recognized for the work we've done. But it's all because we shape partnership. that we looked at who's doing this good that we can connect with, that we can bring something to the table that can be a blessing to them. They can bring capacity to the work that we want to do that we don't have at the moment, and utilize that to allow us to kind of have a greater impact than we can have. And I think that that is one of the beauties of partnership. That if you look at most of the work we've done, it's been out of partnership, and we believe in partnership.
Now, you mentioned something there. You guys have been doing HIV and AIDS work for a long time. That at one time was, let's just be honest, taboo in the church. It was kind of those people over there have that problem. What did you now? Community of Hope is a different animal, but I know that you've been in more traditional settings as well. What does a church do to kind of move itself beyond its comfort zone, beyond the people that we're accustomed to the people who could really need our help?
So I think what the church has to realize is that most of the issues that you're thinking about doing are not outreach, they're in reach. Most of us think that to deal with HIV and AIDS, it's an outreach issue. It's an in-reach issue. There are people in your congregation who are dealing with, who are impacted, who are infected or affected by HIV and AIDS. In every congregation, there's no way in the world you have a Black congregation and you don't have people in there who are infected or affected by HIV and AIDS. There's no way in the world you have a Black congregation in this region and don't have people who have dealt with or have been affected by gun violence or by violence. There's just no way in the world. There's no way in the world that you have a congregation of Black folks that you don't have folks who are affected by wealth disparity stuff. Or, like there's no way in the world. Your whole congregation can be rich, but they got some cousin in them who are reaching out to them who need some help. Like there's no way. And as rich as they are, the reality is they would be more paid than they were if it wasn't for the wealth disparity, and the disparity in income and those kinds of pieces. Like we keep framing stuff as if we're helping those people out there. And we've got to understand that we're really helping us in here. And when you understand the in here, then it helps you connect with the out there, because then they're no longer somebody outside of you. They have a similar issue that you have. So then it's not the church going to help those people with the issue. It is, we're dealing with the issues that are in here, and they help inform us as we're dealing with the folks that we can then reach out to that are in the community that haven't necessarily come into the church yet, so that when they come in, we can let them know that you're not different than us and we're no different than you, and all of us are God's children trying to make it along this journey.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. Absolutely awesome. So let me ask you this. What do you say to the person who says the church isn't connecting to the community? Because I know you did a lot of great work in Ferguson, and you are not in Ferguson. You in Temple Hills District, High Hillcrest. What do you say to the people that say the church? Eddie, I'm talking in circles, but Eddie Glaude a few years ago wrote an article saying the Black church is dead. Talking about how the Black church has lost its place at the center of the community. The Black church doesn't do what it used to do. Now, while our lives have changed and things are different, what do you say to that as somebody who has been both locally and nationally active?
So I say a couple of things. One, I say that we have to stop romanticizing the civil rights movement and stop acting as if every church was down with King. I mean, a whole denomination split because of Dr. King. That's the reason you got Progressive National Baptist Convention and National Baptist Convention. Like that was around this central kind of a thing. So that there have always been different spaces people found themselves on. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is that I think that as a church, we are our own worst PR firm. In Ferguson, you had all these people talking about where's the church, and at night when I would look at the footage, I would see at least 4 or 5 preachers right there on the front line getting tear gas.
Sure.
They didn't have on they didn't have on collars, they didn't have on preacher's garb, that kind of stuff. But I knew they were preachers. Like I was like, no, they seminary trained. They went to seminary. They went to blah blah blah. And so you could see it. And so I think that one of the challenges people have is they're saying that the church isn't engaged. And the challenge I often say to some activists who are out there, who are Christians, who are out there and they're doing it, but they want to give a critique of what the church is not. As I say, but you're right there and you're part of the church. And so you've got to stop seeing yourself as just outside of everything, but you're also a part of the institution. And your presence itself is the church being present. And so I think, I mean, especially for this younger generation, a lot of the young cats who are out here doing it aren't pastors and they're not major names, but they're doing it from a faith perspective. Just throughout this whole season, I have this phrase that I've been talking about. You know how people talk about first responders? I talk about faith responders. And if you look at this whole COVID season and this whole what I call pandemic, the season of pandemic protests and politics, that we have seen faith responders. We have seen people who are on the front lines, whether it's been the front lines of helping people in pandemic, whether it's around food insecurity and that kind of stuff, whether it's on the front lines and protests, on the front lines and dealing with the police brutality and all that stuff, or politics and trying to, shift what was happening in the White House. That if you look, there are people who are on the front lines, and those are faith people. They're Christians. They're people who came out of the church, people who go to the church, people who are pastored by pastors in the church. Some of them are pastors themselves. But it's playing itself and it looks a little differently, but the church is there. It's just that if you don't have the eyes to see it, you'll miss it, because the church isn't saying, da, 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 here I come to save the day, da, 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 da. Right? Y'all like that. Come on now.
Come on, y'all. Give them some smiley faces in the chat.
Come on, y'all got to give me something for the here I come to save the day. Just something, somebody help a preacher here. Right, but the church hasn't come like that, and so then everybody's like, the church isn't there, the church is dead. When the church is very much alive, it's just engaging in a different kind of a way, as well as churches were supporting a lot of those folks. Churches were sending money. Churches were opening up their doors for the organizing meetings. There were churches that were doing an awful lot in the midst of all of that stuff, and so I believe the church is very alive.
Well, let me ask you this. We're rounding the bend. One of the things that's interesting to me is, the last 4 years have given us a laser sharp focus on a problem, the last 4 years in the country. And I've always said that part of what made the power of the civil rights movement is that everybody was in the same boat. So we were all rowing in the same direction on things. Now that, as politics do, they have shifted, what should we be doing to make sure that we are not just fighting against, but now that there's a different political administration, what should we be doing to make sure we're fighting for now?
One, we should be making clear and laying out our agenda to this new administration. And we should be holding their feet to the fire. This administration would not be there if it was not for the Black church and Black people.
Absolutely.
Hands down. There's no way in the world they would be there. And so then we cannot allow them. Often what happens with parties is that Black folks will get them in and they shout and they thank Black folks and all that kind of stuff. But as soon as they get in, they start talking about the need to heal everybody and to bring everybody together, but that is often at the expense of Black people who got them in. So the very issues that Black people and that they, campaigned on and said they were going to work on for Black folks, and Black folks got them in. Now all of a sudden it's like, well, we need y'all to be patient. We're not going to be able to do all of that because that we don't want to totally offend the white suburban folks, blah, blah. They never could depend on those folks to get in. But the very folks they couldn't depend on to get in are now the folks they want to appease, but it always comes at the expense of Black folks. So we have to say, what is our agenda? What are the needs in our communities? What are the things we want to see happen in political process? And then in shaping that kind of platform, then being able to go and holding this administration's feet to the fire to say, no, you are not going to back up off of it. No, there's certain things that you're just going to have to produce on. And if you don't produce, you're going to feel it next go round. And you're going to feel us this whole 4 years. You're going to feel us because you're going to be able to produce for us because we produce for you, because there's no way you would be in. Think about it. Georgia, right?
My good friend Raphael Warnock, Senator.
Raphael Warnock, right? So, right. So we didn't just give them the White House. We also put the balance in the Senate, right? So that you could actually do something. We give you all of this, and now all of a sudden you can't deal with our issues and our stuff. Nah. You're going to need to be able to produce for us because we produce for you. And that's what politics is now. I mean, let's be real.
Sure.
And so we need to be able to make sure to hold folks accountable. But you can't hold folks accountable if you don't know what you want. You can't hold folks accountable if you don't have an agenda. And a lot of times we walked around agenda-less and just say, hey, be nice to me. No. You need to have an agenda. You can't depend on people to be nice to you. Our history in this country has not been people being nice to us. We've had to fight for every movement we've moved forward. We've had to fight for. And you have to be very diligent in this season.
It reminds me of that scene from Fences when the young man asks his father, why don't you like me? And his father tells him, I ain't got to like you. I got a responsibility to you. And they ain't got to like us, but they got a responsibility to us.
Now, I'm gonna tell you what was so impressive about what you just did is that you gave a pop culture reference, but it was just so impressive because it's Fences, it was a play, it was a movie, it was all of that, right? Now, if we had been on the phone with our good friend Reverend Matthew Watley, he'd have gave us something from The Godfather, he'd have gave us something from Rudy or something like that, right? It'd have been something real crazy. But thank you, sir, for that. Your church should salute you. That's why you're Dr. Darrell Williams.
I will go find a little August Wilson for you every now and then. Chat, how do you get connected to the Black Church Pack?
On the Black Church Pack, you can go to blackchurchpack.org, blackchurchpack.org, and all the information is right there. Okay. Or Black Church Pack is on Instagram as well. But those are some of the ways to be able to get connected. All
right. Well, Dr. Lee, we thank you for your time this evening. We are rounding that last base heading home. Anything you want to leave us with? Any words of encouragement, beatbox, or a jump shot? Anything you got? My
favorite member of the Williams family is Ryan. Thank you so much.
Your favorite member of the Williams family is Ryan. Well, God bless you, Pastor Lee. We thank you. Let's light up the chat. Let's give him some hand claps, some praise hands. Let's thank the Lord for Reverend Tony Lee for spending his time with us. I think this was great, informative, and it helps us to realize that Christian and activist are not two different words. Being an activist is part of being a Christian. The book of Acts tells us that they were those who had turned the world upside down. Now it is our turn to turn the world upside down. Everybody, thank you for tuning in tonight. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we will be out of here. Father in heaven, we thank you that you have sent us to change the world. We thank you that you've sent us to turn the world upside down by doing your work, your will, and your way. We thank you that you are moving us forward, organizing us, and helping us to change the world in your image. So, Lord, help us to make the beloved community. Help us to fight against powers in high places, and help us to bring your will to this world. Let your kingdom come and your will be done, and help us to be parts of it. Now, Lord, as we go from this place, but not from each other, we ask you to bless us, keep us, and bind us together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless you all.
Amen.
Us. Don't forget, tomorrow night we've got our 40 Days in the Holy Spirit book club, and then we'll see you for worship on Sunday at 8, 10:30, and noon. God bless you, everybody. Good night, and we'll see you next week for session 3 of Lent Talks.
Shout out Christy Harris, Jaywick Avenue forever.